Well, everybody, good morning again. Thanks for being here today. Paula and Jorge, thank you as always for your music, and Elaine and the choir for what you do and you're going to do. And to Linda, being up and not being nervous at all, it seemed, but thank you. Someone said that there are two kinds of tragedy in the world. One is the kind we can anticipate, and then the ones that come without warning. We're really familiar with both types. Tragedy from Hurricane Irene and now Tropical Storm Lee wreaked havoc in the Northeast and in the Mid-Atlantic states. Our sister congregation in New Bern, North Carolina, had its roof torn off when Irene went through a few weeks ago. And was the reason I couldn't go that Sunday, and we'll have to go to do a service with them on the 16th of October. People in Pennsylvania and New York have evacuated their homes as floods from both storms have ravaged the area. There was some warning, of course. At some point, people had to make plans to take what possessions they could. In our own personal lives, we worry and contemplate spots on our lungs, or what's going on with our mothers, or our fathers, or our children. We worry about the prospect of possible layoffs, or whether we'll have enough money for retirement. The list goes on and on. But to some degree, we can anticipate. But then, the second kind of tragedy forces us to instantly react without any warning. An earthquake strikes in an area where they're rare, and tragedy ensues. A fire burns in central Washington state this morning that suddenly burst into life 2 days ago and has burned many homes with very little warning because the fire has moved so fast. And 10 years ago this morning, 4 airliners were transformed into weapons and came out of a clear blue sky to change our feelings about security and what it means to live in a violent world. Now, our administrator, Julie, and I looked to find the bulletin for the Sunday after 9/11/2001, and we couldn't find it. It's upstairs in Founder's House, and say no more. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to share a few words about what we did in Springfield, Illinois, where I was for the first year of a 2-year interim there. Of course, 9/11 happened on a Tuesday, and they had a memorial service that night, or service of remembrance, reflection. And then we busily changed the whole service for that following Sunday. I emailed people, because even then I was into email, and we asked everyone in the congregation to bring a candle and a candle holder, if possible. What I planned to do was to have a portion of the service where in silence, or at least verbal silence, people would come up, light a candle, and put it on a long table we had at the front of the sanctuary. And in this particular church, the sanctuary is going to be the future fellowship hall, a little bit like the one at the end of the hall, so no windows. So it's very dark, and we deliberately made it that way. But the other thing I decided to do was to have the Lago movement from the New World Symphony by Dvorak played as a CD in the background. And for those of you who were here this morning for the morning reflection, I played that in its entirety. As the music played softly, people came up, they helped each other light candles, and then they went back to their seats. And then something very eerie happened. I have never forgotten it. As the last person in that congregation of about 160 people came up, lit a candle, and put it in the sand, the music came to an end. The silence was breathtaking. People were crying. snuffling, sighing. The silence was grace, and it couldn't have planned it in 100 years. It was astonishing. So I don't know what you folks did here, but my hope would be that it was as meaningful as it was full of folks there. Now, of course, it's 10 years later. I don't need to share the history of the decade. We all know it, or at least some of it. There's still conspiracy theories that refuse to die. And there are still people dying today from the repercussions of what happened then. And then, of course, we know that the genesis of 9/11 took place generations and even millennia ago, where a spiraling series of thoughts, words, or deeds ended up with the planes crashing into towers, but also our reaction thereafter. Now, it's tempting to dwell, as many people are doing today, on that tragedy. There's the public service this morning in Pendleton, where they were ringing a bell 2,799 times. They're having a flag lowered to half staff and so on. And those ceremonies, like the ones in New York and Washington, D.C. and so on, are very important. But they can hold us back from looking in the other direction to the future. So the question I want to ask this morning is, are we only at the 10th anniversary of a tragedy to mourn, or are we halfway to a new generation, 20 years, that has gained insight and wisdom and compassion? Now, I will warn those of you who get excited about such things that we will have no conversation afterwards, after the sermon and before the closing hymn. And the reason is that sometimes reflection is as powerful as talk. And today is one of those days when I think we need to remember in silence some of these powerful stories. Now, another way to ask the question I just posed is, are we prepared to create new cycles of violence with our thoughts, words, or deeds? Or are we going to, as a society, or as individuals, or as a congregation, learn how to break that pattern? In Buddhism, karma, the law of cause and effect. How do we break it? Now, the human tendency, if you haven't noticed, to cycle violence and counter-violence is very much with us. Look at, for example, the partisanship in American politics today. It isn't just in Washington, D.C., it is at all levels. It is violence. Watch how news outlets fan the flames of verbal violence and extremism on all sides. Note the level of stress in the world and anxiety as the economic roller coaster gets more and more convoluted. It's scary times. Is it any wonder that we might actually want to mourn a world that suddenly changed 10 years ago from a place where the blue skies of peace became the smoky skies of war? And mightn't we yearn for the good old days prior to September 11th, 2001, when it seemed a little bit more certain and clear? We could say, like Kathleen Parker and George Will, columnists, said yesterday in the Washington Post, the United States has lost its way, and we're confused. Others of a religious bent might say quite solemnly or excitedly that human beings are inherently broken and we are reaping the results of our sinfulness. Now, as a Unitarian Universalist, I beg to differ. I believe that we are actually in the process of an awakening to deeper and broader compassion as Americans and as a species. This is why. When the Dalai Lama spoke in his reading about why he believed tragic or bad news always came first, he was saying something fairly radical to the people who were present at that meeting. He was saying that, yes, we do have tragedy. We do have the unexpected events of life, like what happened to Kyle. But then the most important part is what happens next and after that. So, what happens when we have a tragedy, whether it's expected or sudden? We're filled with shock and disbelief. Then we might be filled with anger or reactive feeling or despair. Then we seek out others, or we may isolate ourselves to feel safe. But then what tends to happen is a time when the inherent interconnectedness and compassion of human beings awaken. We saw it after the tragedy in Japan, or the kindness of strangers during an accident on the highway I saw the other day. You may remember that countries and people around the world offered their sympathy and support for this country after 9/11. And one wonders what options this country might have had to lead the world into a post-fossil fuel future. One only knows. That opportunity passed for good or ill, and we can't go back and change it. However, it is incumbent upon us as religious liberals to consider the Dalai Lama's words and ask ourselves, what could we do for the 20th anniversary of 9/11? What do we want to experience, see, do, or understand on September 20th, 2021? Because if our universalist ancestors were right, every person living and to be born someday is not doomed to hell, whether of our own creation or otherwise. That all beings, all people, will be welcomed to a heaven of wholeness and wisdom. So, let's take that as an assumption for a moment. What are we, Unitarian Universalists and religious liberals and seekers in Clemson, South Carolina, going to do our part to find that place of wholeness? 10 years from now, 10 years from this day, what will we have done? Well, first, you probably, I hope, saw the banner outside today on the infamous blank wall. And the blank wall is right in back of you outside. That banner, the Standing on the Side of Love campaign, began as a Unitarian Universalist initiative in 2009. It started primarily because of a shooting and killing of people at one of our churches in Tennessee. The goals for the Standing on the Side of Love campaign included these goals: to create local groups to address discrimination in their own communities. This might include lobbying for same-sex marriage, calling for immigration reform, or protesting hate crimes. This is by committee, obviously. But what the premise, when you get out of your head and into your heart, of these groups was to reach out beyond speaking to the choir, because everybody thinking the same, of course, to the larger community and saying, hey, here are some things we have in common. Here are some areas where we really need to work together, to face violence together with a kindness and courage of love and compassion. Takes more than just a small group of religious liberals. And so what's happened since 2009 is the Standing on the Side of Love campaign has been at work all over North America. Now, we have that banner for a number of reasons here in Clemson. One reason is our history of being an official welcoming congregation for people who are gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual, or basically seeking to understand their sexual identity. It is clear that it doesn't end when you get a plaque or a certification that says you've done it. It always has to keep going. So Kathy Crane and Pam Milton and Cindy Burke and Carol Ward and myself and others are planning the next stage of the Welcoming Congregation program here. And we're also working with Peace Church, UCC, which meets here in the afternoons at 5. What we're doing is we're reaching out to each other as equals. And we're standing with them on the side of compassion and shared justice, because that work is never done, number one. And number two, we can't do it all ourselves. We have to keep reaching out beyond our walls. Another aspect of our work here to make people grow wiser and deeper with compassion and confidence and so on is something about deepening and growing their spiritual awareness of the world around us beyond our skin. Because sometimes, believe it or not, our egos get in the way. Mine does. So Marguerite Kirsch and Meg MacArthur are leading 2 proposed programs that show us paths towards wholeness and compassion, starting with ourselves, but then reaching out beyond ourselves, beyond our skin, beyond our cravings, beyond our emotions to others. One class is a beta testing program I think I've mentioned called Quest. It was started by the Madison, Wisconsin UU Church, and it's a 2-year program with classes and retreats. But the emphasis is to look in the mirror and say, who am I? What is my depth? Where is my awareness? What is my gift to myself and the world? That's one. The second program is a workshop called the Ira Progroff Intensive Journal Workshop. And this focuses on our unconscious awareness growing into wisdom. It uses dream work, I believe, and other means to take what we already have and become more aware, to understand why we move and think and feel in the ways we do. If you want to see Marguerite or Meg after the service, please do so that they can answer any questions you have. Now, these projects and so much else that you do here, like Green Sanctuary and so on, are ways in which to break the cycle of ignorance or violence or confusion so that the world and we can be a better place. But back to 9/11. A number of months ago, I speculated, which is always a danger. I began to wonder in my mind, I think this was probably, January, February. I began to think, so I wonder what Unitarian Universalist communities are going to be doing about 9/11, 2011, the 10th anniversary. And as it turned out, I was wondering what might happen here in Clemson. So what I ended up doing was I started to get some folks together from this congregation and from Peace Church and the university community. And to be honest, I spun my wheels. I didn't get very much done. A few people would show up, and we'd try to get some ideas together. But, it was like pushing a stone up a hill. I just wasn't real good at it. And then on top of that, I had to leave the summer on a trip already planned. So I hoped that wiser people than me would do something. Well, I come back from a little drive across the United States and back, and what do I discover? I was filled with gratitude when I returned and found out how much work has been accomplished by people like Pat Sangoli and Christine Prado and others from this congregation, along with Reverend Susie Smith and Cynthia Werner from Peace Church, and of course Peter Cohen, who's the Reformed Jewish rabbi and faculty member at Clemson, many of you know, and people from Clemson Islamic Society and so many others. I come back, and this little group that was trying to meet, they were a big group, and they had this program, and they had everything getting organized, and they're still getting organized, but it's really incredible what they have done. And what they did is what Linda mentioned earlier, this program this afternoon, remembering September 2001, looking back, looking forward toward compassion, peace, and reconciliation. And as Linda said, it's at 4 o'clock today at Cook Center. Now, there are a lot of reasons that I'm grateful to Pat and the others who got this together, and I'll just mention briefly two. One is that we Unitarian Universalists showed that outreach to other religious and cultural traditions is not idealist nonsense. It is hard work, as I'm sure Pat could say, but it takes perseverance, and we don't quite know the outcome. But what we do know is we reach beyond our walls to other traditions, and we start finding things in common. And then we take whatever we have in common, and we start working with that rather than what might divide us. The end result this afternoon will be an event that says the past cannot be changed. But the future is filled with possibilities. Or to put it, as Robert Kennedy said in the opening words, tragedy is a tool for the living to gain wisdom, not a guide by which to live. That's one reason. There's another reason why I appreciate what this congregation and others have done to make this program today come to pass. It's a bit selfish. Don't shoot me. Okay? This is selfish. I want you to imagine 10 years from now on or about September 11th, 2012. It'll probably be the 9th or the 12th or something like that. It'll be a Sunday. You and a lot of other folks are going to be sitting together in this sanctuary. Your minister that you pick soon will have been here for some years of shared ministry. Your numbers have increased, your children have grown up, and they speak of your courage during hard times. Your minister in 2021 might sometime mention that they were really impressed by Clemson in 2011. Because what they did was they went to a website, which I and some other people got together within the UUA. They went to a website that showed a whole bunch of events on 9/11, 2011. And they were excited when they saw, under South Carolina, a congregation that had reached out to other communities and had this great program that they had developed beyond their doors. And that minister might stop for a minute and say that they were really impressed that a so-called small fellowship in the South was able to create a gathering that said, some of us is greater than the parts. Perhaps that minister or others will express their delight that the cycle of violence began to end here and in the other places where Unitarian Universalist congregations stand on the side of love, but don't do it alone. Not the romantic love that ebbs and flows, but the deeper love that has a backbone of courage and a heart that is filled over the whole world. Those are your hearts. Yours and your families and your friends, the people you know, the people who are struggling, the people not within this room. But they're all your hearts. And your hearts all beat almost in unison. 60, 72, 90, whatever times a minute. But if you were able to put your hearts on some kind of sound that could be heard in this room, they'd all be beating together, as all the ones are in the world. So, those are your hearts. What I'm going to suggest for a couple of moments is that we stop, again, in this busy life we lead. Take a deep breath and remember our lives over the last 10 years. Those here in this fellowship, all that you've done during dark times and wonderful times. Those of you who are visitors here for the first time, who may be students, or young adults working in your first jobs or second jobs and trying to make it all fit together in a world that's very confused for all of us. As you sit for a few moments, I'd invite you to consider that remembering the shock of a great tragedy is important, as today will show us. But what is equally and perhaps even more important is moving beyond the tragedy to shape a world based upon compassion rather than hatred. For that generation of September 11th, 2021, they're waiting for us. So in silence for a few moments, just think about what your role will be as a spiritual seeker, as a Unitarian Universalist or a religious liberal, as someone who's trying to make the world a bit of a better place. What's your role for 10 years from now, when there are still memorials and words of remembrance? But perhaps not just remembrance, but reconciliation and a reaching out beyond the boundaries and confusions that exist in the human heart. That our hearts be strong. That your heart beat not only for your body, but for your love. We all stand on the side of love without exception. We are all entitled to love without exception. But we must work at it. And sometimes we have to go through the hard night to make it so.